"He doesn't respond, Your Grace. No matter how hard we try." The midwife's words sliced through the pre-dawn air like icy blades, and Michael felt a heavy weight settle in his chest as he watched the Duke crumble before his eyes. The man who had commanded armies and governed with an iron fist for 2 decades stood there, hunched over an ornate cradle, his hands trembling like leaves in the wind. "Try again," the Duke whispered, his voice brittle as dry branches. "Please, try again." Michael remained at the entrance to the ducal chambers, still wearing the travel-stained armor from the urgent ride that had brought him back to the keep before sunrise. The sound of the chapel bells echoed incessantly through the stone corridors, but here, in this suffocating room where flickering candles cast dancing shadows on the tapestries, a different silence reigned. It was the silence of a child born perfect in every way but one. The midwife picked up the sacred bronze bell she had brought from the cathedral, the same one that had awakened generations of royal newborns, and rang it vigorously near the cradle. The metallic sound reverberated through the walls like thunder, making Michael instinctively brace himself for the cry that should follow. But the baby remained still, his tiny fists moving slowly in the air, his blue eyes fixed on an undefined point above his head. Beautiful, robust, seemingly healthy, yet living in a world where bells did not exist. "My God," Emily murmured from the other side of the room, where she had spent the night trying to comfort the Duchess. Her voice carried a mixture of compassion and horror that made something contract painfully in Michael's stomach. "The baby is deaf." The word hung in the air like a death sentence. A deaf heir. A future duke who could not hear the cries of battle, the counsel of his ministers, the pleas of his people. Michael watched the realization spread across the faces present like a blight. First shock, then fear, finally a cold calculation about what this would mean for the stability of the duchy. "No," the Duke said, straightening abruptly, a desperate fury replacing the despair in his eyes. "I won't accept this. There must be something we can do, someone who can—" "Your Grace." Lord Harrison's voice cut the declaration short like a sharp blade. The advisor had appeared in the doorway like an elegant shadow, his impeccable attire contrasting cruelly with the emotional chaos of the room. "Perhaps it would be prudent to discuss the implications of this situation away from unnecessary ears." His eyes fixed on Michael with an icy disdain that needed no words to convey its message. Knights did not belong in discussions of royal succession, especially when the news could shake the foundations of power. Michael felt anger rise like a red tide. There was something about the way Harrison spoke, as if the child were a political problem to be solved rather than a baby needing love and protection, that provoked every protective instinct in his body. Emily moved closer to the cradle, extending a careful finger that the baby immediately grasped with surprising strength. "Look," she whispered, wonder tinging her voice. "He reacts to touch, to movement. There is intelligence in his eyes." "Intelligence does not govern duchies," Harrison replied coldly, "and a child who cannot hear counsel or command troops will be seen by neighboring nobles as a weakness to be exploited." The Duke looked at his son, then at Harrison, then at Michael, and in that moment of desperate hesitation, Michael saw the entire tragedy about to unfold. He saw a father willing to sacrifice everything to protect a child the world had already judged inadequate. He saw Emily trying to defend a baby she barely knew, and he saw Harrison calculating exactly how to use that vulnerability to achieve his own ends. "Michael," the Duke said abruptly, turning to him with sudden determination, "you have experience with injured children. Do you see something the rest of us are missing?" It was a question laden with desperate hope, and Michael knew his answer would shape not only Alexandra's fate, but the future of everyone in that room. The air was thick with the smell of melted wax and anguish, and every person present held their breath awaiting his words. Michael approached the cradle, ignoring Harrison's icy stare, and observed the baby who would change his life forever. Alexandra, still unnamed, yet already carrying the weight of a duchy on his tiny shoulders. There was something in those blue eyes, an alert curiosity that defied the shadows of tragedy already beginning to form around him. "I see a child," Michael finally said, his voice cutting the silence like a well-tempered sword. "A strong, intelligent child who simply experiences the world differently than we expect." Harrison chuckled softly, a humorless sound that made Emily tense up. Different experience. What a delicate term for a disability that might cost a duchy. And what a cruel term, Michael countered, turning to face Harrison directly, for a difference that might teach an entire realm new ways to lead. The challenge was laid down. There, in that room where a baby slept oblivious to the storms his simple existence had unleashed, the battle lines were drawn. Harrison, with his cold elegance and calculated ambitions, representing everything that saw Alexandra as an obstacle. Michael, with his simple loyalty and protective heart, determined to prove that a deaf child could be as valuable as any heir ever born. And between them, Emily delicately held Alexandra's tiny hand, as if she could shield him from the entire world through the strength of her will. What none of them knew was that this moment, this decision to fight rather than accept, would set events in motion that would test not only a deaf baby's ability to communicate with the world, but also love's capacity to triumph over the darkest ambition. The future of a duchy was about to be decided not by swords or gold, but by something far more powerful and dangerous: the determination of ordinary people to protect those they love, no matter the cost. The morning fog still spread over the valley when the urgent gallop echoed over the stone paths. Michael adjusted the reins with hands that trembled slightly, not from the biting cold, but from the anxiety that grew in his chest with every beat of the hooves against the uneven ground. The messenger who had summoned him had left without explanation, only the Duke's seal pressed into red wax and sharp words: "Come immediately. The duchy needs you." The towers of Ehrenwald Keep emerged through the mist like stone ghosts, their banners violently whipping against the cold wind. Michael knew every curve of that road, every mark on the walls, every sound that echoed through the courtyards. He had served the House of Ehrenwald since he was 16, when his father, a knight from modest lands, had presented him to the Duke as a squire. Now at 28, he wore the oath of fealty like a second skin, but he had never felt its weight as intensely as he did that morning. As he rode through the main gate, the unusual agitation hit him like a cold wave. Guards hurried back and forth with tense expressions, servants whispered in nervous groups, and the sound of the chapel bells echoed incessantly, breaking the usual morning silence. Michael dismounted with quick movements, handing the reins to a stable boy whose hands shook as much as his own. What happened here? He muttered to himself, observing the frantic movement around him. A midwife rushed past, her face pale as wax, carrying basins of water that sloshed with every hurried step. Monks walked toward the towers with thick books pressed against their chests, their faces bearing the gravity that only emerged when something terrible occurred within the walls of a noble house. It was then that his eyes found a familiar figure at the top of the marble staircase leading to the main chambers. Lady Emily, daughter of the Earl of Ravenshollow, stood there like an ivory statue, her hands clasped against her embroidered skirt and her face turned toward the courtyard with an expression Michael knew well. It was the look she always wore when witnessing injustice at court, a mixture of contained pain and helplessness that made something contract painfully in his chest. Her brown hair escaped slightly from its elaborate arrangement, dancing against the wind like silk threads, and the grey morning light accentuated the paleness of her skin. Emily always seemed made of light and shadow at the same time, delicate as porcelain, but with an inner strength that shone through her green eyes when she believed no one was watching. And Michael was always watching. He couldn't help it. For 5 years, since she had arrived at court as the Duchess's lady-in-waiting, he had caught himself searching for her presence in the corridors, memorizing the sound of her steps against the marble, treasuring every brief but intense conversation they shared in the library, every genuine smile she offered upon his return from missions. But the distance separating them was an unbridgeable chasm. She was the daughter of an influential earl, educated in the refined ways of the nobility, destined for marriages that would strengthen political alliances. He was merely a sworn knight of modest origin, whose value lay in his sword and loyalty, not in lands or titles. Yet there was something between them, something that grew silently in the prolonged glances during ceremonies, in the brief but intense conversations, in the moments she smiled genuinely upon seeing him return from missions. It was an invisible current that connected them, dangerous and impossible, yet real as the air they breathed. Now, watching her on that staircase, Michael felt the familiar impulse to climb up to her, to offer some comfort, to ask what was happening. But before he could move, a grave voice echoed behind him. Michael of Greystone. Finally, he turned and found himself facing Lord Harrison, the Duke's financial advisor and one of the most influential men at court. Tall and elegant, with perfectly combed dark hair and clothes that cost more than Michael earned in a year, Harrison was the embodiment of power that came from gold, not blood or honor. There was something in his eyes, a calculated coldness that always made Michael feel as if he were being evaluated as a piece in a chess game. "Lord Harrison." Michael bowed his head respectfully but kept his shoulders straight. "The Duke summoned me." "Yes, he is desperate." The word left Harrison's mouth as if it tasted bitter. Desperate situations make men seek improbable solutions. There was a subtle provocation in the words, a thinly veiled contempt that made Michael's muscles tense. Harrison had always made it clear that he considered the knight a minor figure in the court hierarchy, useful only for tasks requiring brute strength or blind courage. But there was something more in that look, something Michael couldn't fully decipher. "If you'll allow my curiosity," Michael kept his voice firm. "What sort of situation?" Harrison smiled, but there was no warmth in the expression. "The heir was born last night, a boy, as the Duke wished. But," he paused dramatically, watching Michael's reaction, "there are complications that jeopardize not only the child, but the entire future of the duchy." The air seemed heavier around Michael. An heir was always cause for celebration, but the atmosphere of the keep suggested tragedy, not festivity. "What kind of complications?" "That," Harrison said, gesturing elegantly toward the towers, "the Duke will explain personally. He is in his chambers, with the Duchess and—" his eyes briefly flickered toward Emily, still motionless on the staircase, "with those he trusts to advise on delicate matters." The implication was clear. Michael was not in the category of people trusted for delicate matters. He was summoned because there was a task, likely unpleasant or dangerous, that needed to be executed by someone expendable. "I will go to him immediately," Michael said, already moving toward the staircase. "Of course you will." Harrison's voice followed him like a shadow. "After all, that is what knights like you exist for, to serve when called, without question." Michael stopped on the first marble step, his fists involuntarily clenching. For a moment he considered turning around and answering the provocation, but then his eyes met Emily's again, and he saw something in them that made him take a deep breath and continue upward. There was a silent plea in that look, a request for him to maintain his composure, not to let Harrison provoke him into doing something reckless. She knew the court games better than he did. She knew when words were traps, and when silence was the only available weapon. As he passed her on the staircase, Emily murmured softly, almost whispering, "Be careful, Michael. Everything changed tonight." He didn't turn to look at her, but her words were etched into his mind like hot iron. He continued climbing, feeling the weight of her gaze on his back and the growing sense that he was walking towards something that would transform his life forever. The corridor leading to the ducal chambers was quieter than usual, but it was a silence charged with tension, like the air before a storm. Michael knocked on the ornate door with 3 firm taps and waited. "Enter." The Duke's voice sounded different. There was a fragility in it that Michael had never heard before, a vulnerability that made his heart clench with apprehension. He pushed the door open and stepped into what would be the beginning of a journey that would test not only his loyalty to the Duke, but also his ability to choose between duty and heart. The main chamber was plunged into a sickly gloom. Heavy curtains blocked the morning light, creating a suffocating atmosphere that made Michael hesitate at the entrance. Candles flickered on the tables, casting dancing shadows on the tapestry-lined walls, and the air carried a strange scent, a mixture of incense, medicinal herbs, and something darker he couldn't identify. The Duke was sitting in a red velvet armchair, hunched forward with his hands covering his face. At 45, he had always been an imposing figure, with broad shoulders and a dominant presence that filled any room, but now he seemed to have aged a decade in one night. His dark hair was disheveled, his beard unshaven, and when he lifted his face to look at Michael, his eyes were red and sunken like caves. "Michael," the voice was hoarse, broken. "Thank heavens you came." "My lord." Michael bowed respectfully, but kept his eyes on the Duke. "I came as soon as I received the summons. How may I serve you?" The Duchess was resting on a chaise longue near the fireplace, pale as a ghost, with a vacant expression that sent a chill down Michael's spine. She had always been a gentlewoman, with an easy smile and sweet words, but now she seemed to have retreated to some deep place within herself, beyond the reach of the outside world. "Sit down." The Duke gestured to a nearby chair. "I need to tell you something, and I need you to listen until the end before saying a word." Michael obeyed, feeling the weight of gravity in his lord's voice. The silence stretched for long seconds, broken only by the crackling of the fire in the hearth and the distant sound of the bells that continued to echo through the corridors. My son was born yesterday on the eve of midnight, the Duke began, his voice gaining a strange serenity. A strong boy, healthy, perfect in every physical aspect. The court physician said he has never seen such a robust newborn. He paused, taking a deep breath. But something is wrong, Michael. Something that could destroy everything I fought to build. Michael's heart began to race. What is it, my lord? He doesn't respond to sounds. The words came out in a whisper, laden with pain. Not the nurses crying, not the clatter of metal, not even the sacred bell I had brought from the cathedral. It's as if, his voice broke, as if he lives in a world of absolute silence. Michael felt the air leave his lungs, a deaf air. In a world where a leader's strength was measured by his presence, by his ability to command armies and inspire loyalty through powerful words, a prince who could not hear would be seen as incomplete. The doctors cannot explain it, the Duke continued, his hands trembling slightly. Some say it might be temporary, others that it is permanent, and there are those who whisper it might be a sign, a divine punishment, or a dark omen for the duchy's future. My lord, surely— No. The Duke raised his hand, interrupting him. You don't understand the gravity of the situation. Harrison is already spreading rumors through the corridors. Some nobles whisper that an imperfect heir makes our house vulnerable to external challenges. Others talk about hiding the truth until a solution is found. His eyes filled with desperate fury. As if my son were ashamed to be concealed. Michael remained silent, processing the implications. He knew the court's political games well, the fragile alliances that kept power balanced, the way any sign of weakness could be exploited by those who coveted more influence. Why did you call me, my lord? He finally asked. The Duke rose abruptly, beginning to pace the room like a caged animal. Because I remembered something. 3 years ago, when that plague hit the village of Millbrook, you were there. You helped the monks care for the injured and the sick children. I saw the way you interacted with them, especially the children who couldn't speak due to the fever. You had a patience, a gentleness I have never seen in other men. Michael felt a strange warmth spread through his chest. He remembered that mission well. He had been sent to ensure supplies reached the village, but ended up staying to help in any way possible. There was something about the sick children, the way their eyes sought connection even when they couldn't communicate normally, that had touched him deeply. I have no medical knowledge, my lord. I am no healer. That is not what I need. The Duke stopped before the window, his back rigid. I need you to observe my son, to spend time with him, to tell me if you see something the others are missing, if there is any way to— He hesitated, to help him connect with the world. It was a strange, almost desperate task. Michael understood the Duke's despair, but wondered if it wouldn't be more prudent to seek help from scholars, from doctors in other lands, from people with real knowledge of such matters. There is one more thing, the Duke said, turning to face him. Lady Emily has been with the child since birth. The Duchess— He looked at his wife, who remained lost in her own thoughts, is too distraught to properly care for the boy. Emily has been our anchor in these difficult times. Michael's heart involuntarily skipped a beat at the sound of her name. The idea of spending time close to Emily, even in such delicate circumstances, provoked a mixture of anticipation and anxiety that he tried to hide. You will work with her, the Duke continued. Emily knows the child's needs, and perhaps you can see something the rest of us are missing. I understand, my lord. When should I begin? Now. The urgency in the Duke's voice was palpable. With every passing hour the rumors spread. Harrison is pressing for decisions to be made quickly, and He ran his hands through his disheveled hair. I need to know if there is hope before I am forced to take measures that might affect my son's future. Michael stood up, squaring his shoulders. I will do everything in my power, my lord. I promise. I know you will. The Duke placed a heavy hand on his shoulder. And Michael, maintain absolute discretion about what you discover. The stability of the duchy may depend on it. When Michael left the chamber, he found Emily waiting for him in the corridor. She was leaning against the stone wall, her arms crossed, and an expression of worry marking her delicate features. The torchlight created golden reflections in her hair, and for the first time since he arrived at the keep, he allowed himself to truly look at her. He told you about the baby, she said. It wasn't a question. Yes. Michael kept his voice low. And about you caring for him. Emily nodded, pushing herself off the wall. Come. It's best you meet him before the malicious tongues of the court convince you that you are facing a monster. They began walking down the corridor, their steps echoing in the silence. Michael was acutely aware of her proximity, the subtle scent of lavender that always seemed to accompany her, the graceful way she moved even in moments of tension. "How is he?" he asked. "He is the most beautiful child I have ever seen," Emily replied, and there was genuine tenderness in her voice. Strong, alert, curious about everything around him. "When I look at him, I don't see disability. I just see difference." The way she said it, with such naturalness and acceptance, made something stir deep within Michael's chest. It was typical of her, this ability to see beyond appearances, to find beauty where others saw only problems. "And how are the others at court reacting?" Emily's face hardened slightly. "As you would imagine, Harrison is behaving as if the world is ending. Some nobles whisper about signs and omens, and there are those who have already begun to speculate about alternatives." "Alternatives?" "There is a distant cousin of the Duke, second in the line of succession. Some think it would be wiser to consider—" She didn't finish the sentence, but Michael understood. The coldness of such a thought shocked him. They were talking about a child less than 2 days old, and people were already willing to discard him in favor of political convenience. They stopped before an ornate door at the end of the corridor. Emily placed her hand on the handle but hesitated before opening it. "Michael," she said, and when she turned to look at him, her green eyes were intense, almost pleading. "I need you to see with your heart, not just with your eyes. This baby, he may be different, but he is no less valuable, no less worthy of love and protection." The passion in her voice, the way she defended this child she had known for so little time, revealed something about Emily that Michael had always known but had never seen expressed so clearly. She was a natural protector, someone who would place herself between the vulnerable and those who would try to harm them. "I will see," he promised, "and I will try to understand." Emily smiled for the first time since he arrived at the keep, and it was as if the dark corridor had filled with sunlight. The baby's room was a sanctuary of golden light. Unlike the Duke's gloomy chambers, here the windows were open, allowing the morning rays to spread over the light wood furniture and soft-toned tapestries. Emily had created an environment that breathed hope, as if trying to compensate with brightness for the darkness threatening to envelop the child. Michael stopped at the entrance, observing the scene unfolding before him. The oak cradle was positioned so that natural light bathed its interior, and within it, wrapped in white linen embroidered with silver threads, lay the heir to the duchy. Even from where he stood, Michael could see that the Duke had spoken the truth about the child's robustness. The baby was large for his age, with proportionate limbs and a presence that, even so small, suggested strength. His dark hair already showed traces of his paternal lineage, and his skin had the healthy pink tone that indicated vitality. "Come," Emily said softly, approaching the cradle. "He won't bite you." Michael advanced cautiously, not out of fear, but out of an instinctive reverence for the vulnerability of new life. When he leaned over the cradle, the child's eyes turned toward him, clear blue eyes that seemed curious and alert, scanning Michael's face with an intensity that surprised him. "Hello, little prince," Michael murmured, carefully extending a finger. The baby moved his head slightly, fixing his gaze on the movement, and Michael had the distinct impression that he was being studied as intensely as he studied the child. "See?" Emily positioned herself on the other side of the cradle, her hands resting delicately on the wooden edge. "He reacts to everything, to movement, to light, to facial expressions. It's only sound that—" She let the sentence die in the air. Michael watched in silence for a few moments, noticing how the child's eyes followed every gesture, how his face contracted slightly when shadows passed over him, how his tiny fists moved in response to visual stimuli. "May I hold him?" he asked. Emily nodded, bending down to lift the baby with secure, experienced movements. When she placed him in Michael's arms, the child didn't protest. On the contrary, he seemed to settle comfortably, his large, curious eyes continuing to explore the new face. Michael felt something strange happen in his chest, an unexpected tenderness, mixed with an instinctive protectiveness that surprised him with its intensity. There was something in those blue eyes, a nascent intelligence that seemed to communicate much more than should be possible for a 2-day-old baby. "What is his name?" he asked, gently rocking him. "The Duke hasn't officially decided yet," Emily replied, "but the Duchess is calling him Alexandra after his great-grandfather, Alexandra." The name matched the child's dignified presence, the way he observed the world around him as if planning to conquer it. "Alexandra," Michael repeated, and he saw something that made his heart race. When he pronounced the name, the baby didn't react to the sound as expected, but reacted to the movements of Michael's lips, intensely fixing his eyes on his mouth, as if trying to understand what was happening there. "Emily," he said carefully, "look at this." He repeated the name again, slightly exaggerating the lip movements, and again the baby focused completely on his mouth. When he stopped speaking and remained still, Alexandra lost interest and returned to exploring other aspects of his face. "He's reading your lips," Emily whispered, growing excitement tinging her voice. "Not exactly reading, but—" Michael continued experimenting, pronouncing different words and observing the reactions. "He is aware that the movements of my mouth mean something. He's trying to understand." Emily moved closer, so close that Michael could feel the warmth of her body, the subtle scent of her hair. "What else do you notice?" Michael shifted Alexandra to one arm, freeing a hand to test other reactions. When he moved his fingers slowly in front of the child's face, Alexandra followed the movement precisely. When he stopped, the baby continued to stare at his hand, as if expecting him to continue. "He anticipates patterns," Michael observed. "He sees something start and expects it to continue." It was then he had an idea. He looked around the room and noticed a small hand mirror on the dresser near the window. "May I have that?" Emily followed his gaze and immediately understood, picking up the mirror and bringing it to him. Michael positioned it carefully, catching the sunlight and gently reflecting it onto the wall near the cradle. The reaction was immediate and stunning. Alexandra turned his head toward the reflected glare, his eyes widening with interest. When Michael moved the mirror slightly, making the light dance, the child tried to follow the movement, his little arms flailing with excitement. "By all the saints," Emily murmured. "Look how he reacts." Michael continued the experiment, creating simple patterns with the reflected light, circular movements, straight lines, points of brightness that appeared and disappeared. With each variation, Alexandra responded with growing enthusiasm, his eyes shining with evident joy. "It's not just sight," Michael said, his voice filled with awe. "It's comprehension. He understands that I am creating something for him, that there is intention behind the movements." Emily was radiant, her hands clasped in an almost prayerful gesture. "He is communicating with us. In his own way, he is responding." For several minutes, they continued exploring different ways to stimulate Alexandra's visual responses. The baby never lost interest, never tired of the interaction. On the contrary, he seemed increasingly engaged, as if he had finally found a way to connect with the world around him. It was Emily who broke the magical moment, gently touching Michael's arm. "Someone is coming," she said in a low voice. Michael heard the approaching footsteps in the corridor, firm, measured steps he recognized immediately. "Harrison, put him back in the cradle," Emily whispered urgently. "And don't mention what we just discovered." Michael obeyed, carefully positioning Alexandra among the soft blankets. The child protested slightly at the loss of contact, but was quickly distracted by the play of light and shadow the curtains created on the ceiling. The door opened unceremoniously, and Harrison entered with his usual dominant presence. His gaze quickly swept the room, stopping first on Emily, then on Michael, and finally fixing on the cradle. "How is the young prince this morning?" he asked, but there was something in his voice that suggested the question was more a formality than genuine interest. "Well," Emily replied with careful diplomacy, "rested and alert." Harrison approached the cradle, observing Alexandra with an expression Michael couldn't fully decipher. There was evaluation there, but also something colder, more calculating. "And you, Sir Michael?" Harrison turned to face him. "What impression do you have of our future leader?" Michael chose his words carefully. "He is a strong and healthy child, Lord Harrison. Anyone can see that." "Strong and healthy, yes," Harrison agreed, but his tone carried a subtle irony. "But strength and health are only part of what defines a leader. A prince must inspire confidence, must be able to command through presence and word." His eyes fixed intensely on Michael, qualities that require all senses to be fully functioning. The provocation was clear, but Michael maintained his composure. "I believe there are many ways to lead, Lord Harrison, and many ways to inspire." "Oh, yes," Harrison smiled, but there was no warmth in the expression. "And what ways would those be?" Before Michael could answer, Emily intervened elegantly. "Lord Harrison, surely you don't expect us to determine the fate of a 2-day-old child based on speculation about limitations that may not even exist." Harrison turned to her, and Michael noticed a subtle shift in his expression, something that seemed almost possessive. "My dear Emily, always so optimistic. It is an admirable quality, though not always practical." He paused deliberately. "Speaking of which, your father mentioned he wishes to speak with us about your immediate future. Important matters that affect not only you, but the entire political stability of our region. The atmosphere in the room became suffocating. Michael felt his muscles involuntarily tense, a cold anger beginning to burn in his chest. Harrison's words were carefully chosen, but the message was clear. Emily was being treated as a piece in a political game, and her own will was irrelevant. Emily paled slightly, but maintained her composure. "Lord Harrison, I believe this is neither the appropriate time nor place for such discussions." "On the contrary," Harrison countered, approaching her with measured steps. "This is exactly the appropriate time. We are all here witnessing the uncertainties surrounding the future of this house. It is crucial that solid alliances be forged to ensure stability during turbulent times." Michael could no longer restrain himself. "With all due respect, Lord Harrison, Lady Emily is here caring for the heir. Perhaps your political matters can wait until the child no longer requires constant attention." Harrison's eyes flashed with something dangerous. "Sir Michael, I appreciate your dedication to duty, but I believe matters involving noble lineage are beyond your area of expertise." The insult was direct and deliberate. Michael felt the blood rush to his face, but before he could respond, a faint voice came from the door. "Harrison, what is going on here?" The Duke stood in the doorway, still looking haggard, but there was an authority in his posture that made everyone straighten up. "Your Grace," Harrison bowed respectfully, "I was merely checking on the young prince's well-being and discussing practical matters with Lady Emily." Practical matters. The Duke entered the room, his eyes quickly scanning the tense expressions of those present. What sort of practical matters? Harrison hesitated for a moment, clearly recalculating his approach. "Matters related to marital alliances that could strengthen our position during this period of uncertainty." The silence that followed was taut as a string about to snap. The Duke looked at Emily, whose face had become a mask of icy courtesy, then at Michael, who struggled to control his expression, and finally back at Harrison. "Harrison," he said calmly, "this room is for the care of my son. Political discussions can be conducted in appropriate places, at appropriate times. Now is not one of them." It was a gentle but clear reprimand. Harrison bowed his head, accepting the correction with forced grace. "Naturally, Your Grace. I apologize for the inconvenience." He turned to Emily, making an elaborate bow. "Lady Emily, we will continue our conversation at a more suitable time." After Harrison left the room, the silence remained heavy for several seconds. The Duke approached the cradle, observing his son with a mixture of love and concern that made Michael's chest ache. "How is he?" he asked softly. Emily and Michael exchanged a quick glance. It was the moment to share what they had discovered, but Michael hesitated, remembering Emily's warning not to mention their findings in Harrison's presence. "He is well," Emily said carefully, very attentive and curious about everything around him. "And you, Michael?" The Duke turned to him. "What observations do you have to share?" Michael took a deep breath. "Your Grace, your child is extraordinarily responsive to visual stimuli. There is an evident intelligence in the way he reacts to movement, light, and facial expressions. He may not hear sounds, but he is definitely communicating and learning through other senses." The Duke's eyes lit up slightly. "You believe there is hope?" "I believe there is much more than hope, Your Grace. There is real potential." For a moment, the tension in the room lessened, replaced by something that resembled genuine relief. But Michael knew that this moment of peace was fragile, and that the forces threatening Alexandra and Emily were only beginning to mobilize. The 3 days that followed brought a subtle but noticeable change in the keep's atmosphere. Michael spent most of his time in the baby's room, developing simple methods to stimulate Alexandra's visual responses, while Emily carefully organized each session as if documenting evidence for a trial, and perhaps she was. Rumors spread through the corridors like fire in dry straw. Michael heard them in fragments, whispers interrupted when he passed, muffled conversations that ceased abruptly when his presence was noted. Some servants spoke of divine signs and celestial punishments. Others speculated about the governing capacity of a prince who could not hear counsel or command troops through shouted orders. But what worried him most were the conversations he couldn't hear, those happening behind closed doors, in Harrison's chambers, in the private council meetings that had become more frequent since Alexandra's birth. Emily was changing too. The growing tension was visible in the lines of her face, in the way her hands trembled slightly when she thought no one was watching, in the way her eyes always averted whenever Harrison appeared in the corridors. Twice Michael found her in the library, lost among scrolls about succession and lineage, as if searching for some forgotten law that could protect Alexandra. "What are you looking for?" he asked one afternoon, when he found her surrounded by ancient documents. "Precedents," she replied without looking up. "Cases of heirs with differences who nonetheless assumed the throne." "And did you find any?" Emily finally looked at him, and there was a deep sadness in her green eyes. "A few, but they are all from different eras with specific circumstances, nothing that applies directly to our situation." Michael approached, observing the scrolls scattered on the table. "Emily, you cannot bear the weight of saving Alexandra alone." "I'm not alone," she said softly. "You are here." The simplicity of the statement hit Michael like a punch. There was so much trust in those words, such certainty that he would remain by her side, that he felt something tighten painfully in his chest. "I always will be," he replied, and the words came out with more intensity than he intended. Emily raised her eyes to his, and for a moment the world seemed to stop. There was something in that look that went beyond gratitude, something that made the air between them vibrate with a tension different from political worry. It was dangerous and inevitable at the same time. "Emily, Lady Emily!" Harrison's voice cut the moment like a blade. They quickly separated, Emily straightening in her chair and Michael stepping back, both struggling to appear casual. Harrison stood at the library entrance, elegant as always, but there was something in his eyes that made Michael instinctively prepare for confrontation. "Lord Harrison," Emily greeted formally, "is there something I can help you with?" "Indeed, yes." Harrison entered the room with measured steps, his eyes scanning the scattered scrolls. "Your father arrived this morning. He would like to speak with us about the arrangements we discussed." The blood seemed to drain from Emily's face. "My father is here, in the great hall, waiting for us." Harrison smiled, but there was no warmth in the expression. "Naturally, these are family matters, so..." His eyes turned to Michael with thinly veiled disdain. "Private." Michael felt anger rise like a high tide. The way Harrison spoke, as if Emily were property to be negotiated, as if her own will were irrelevant, provoked a fury he had difficulty controlling. "Emily," he said carefully, "you don't have to..." "I do, yes." She stood up abruptly, smoothing her skirt with hands that trembled slightly. "They are family obligations, you understand." But Michael saw the thinly disguised terror in her eyes, the way her shoulders slumped, as if she were bracing for a blow. She was being dragged into a situation she did not want, and there was nothing he could do to stop her without causing a scandal that could destroy her reputation. "Of course," he said, his voice sounding harsher than intended. "Family matters." Harrison smiled with satisfaction, offering his arm to Emily. "Come, my dear. It is unwise to keep an earl waiting." When they left the library, Michael remained standing amidst the scattered scrolls, his hands clenched into fists so tight that his nails left marks on his palms. The feeling of helplessness was suffocating. He was just a knight, without lands, without title, without political power to challenge men like Harrison or the Earl. But there was Alexandra, and there was Emily. And if he couldn't protect them through social standing, perhaps he could find another way. In the days that followed, Michael intensified his work with Alexandra, developing increasingly sophisticated visual communication through gestures and facial expressions. The baby was clearly thriving with the attention, his eyes shining with an intelligence that grew day by day. But Emily was changing. She still came to care for Alexandra, but there was a new sadness in her demeanor, a resignation that hadn't existed before. Her conversations with Michael became shorter, more formal, as if she were preparing to emotionally distance herself. It was on a cold afternoon, when rain drummed against the windows of Alexandra's room, that Emily finally revealed what had happened. "I am to marry Harrison," she said simply, without preamble, while cradling Alexandra in her arms. Michael felt as if he had been punched in the stomach. "When?" "Within 2 months. My father has already signed the contracts." Her voice was empty, devoid of the passion that usually carried it. "He says it is a necessary alliance to protect our lands and our influence." "And you? What do you say?" Emily didn't answer immediately. She continued rocking Alexandra, who slept peacefully in her arms, oblivious to the drama unfolding around him. "I say that a woman of my position does not have the luxury of choosing based on personal feelings," she finally replied. "I say there are responsibilities greater than individual desires." But her voice broke slightly on the last words, betraying the facade of acceptance she tried to maintain. "Emily, look at me." She hesitated, then slowly raised her eyes. There were tears there, tears she fought fiercely not to shed. "This is not right," Michael said, his voice low but intense. "You cannot be forced into a marriage you despise to satisfy political ambitions." "Can't I?" A bitter laugh escaped her lips. "Michael, you are a good and honorable man, but sometimes you are naive about how the world truly works. Women like me exist to strengthen alliances. That is how it has always been. It doesn't have to be that way forever, doesn't it?" She moved closer to him, and Michael could feel the pain radiating from her like heat from a fire. "Then tell me, Sir Michael of Greystone, what alternative do you offer? What future can you promise that outweighs lands, titles, and political influence?" It was a cruel but fair question. Michael had nothing to offer but his heart and his sword. Against Harrison's wealth and power it seemed ridiculously inadequate, but then Alexandra stirred in Emily's arms, opening his clear blue eyes and fixing them on Michael with that expression of infinite curiosity, and something clicked in his mind. "Harrison wants to get rid of Alexandra," he said slowly. Emily blinked, surprised by the sudden change of subject. "What? Harrison? He's not just interested in marrying you. He wants control over the succession, and a deaf heir doesn't fit his plans." Michael felt the pieces fitting together. If something happened to Alexandra, or if he were deemed unfit to rule, the Duke's cousin would become the heir, and Harrison has influence over him. Emily's face paled. "Are you suggesting Harrison would harm a child?" "I am suggesting that Harrison is ambitious enough to see Alexandra as an obstacle, not a person." Michael moved closer, his voice dropping to an urgent whisper. "And I am suggesting that perhaps it is time we stopped reacting to his moves and started making our own." For the first time in days, a glimmer of something like hope returned to Emily's eyes. Harrison's conspiracy revealed itself more subtly and venomously than Michael had imagined. 3 nights after his conversation with Emily in the library, he was awakened by urgent knocking on his door. Outside, he found Brother Marcus, one of the chapel monks, his face pale and his hands trembling. "Sir Michael," the cleric whispered, looking nervously down the corridors, "I need to speak with you. It's about the young prince." Michael led him inside, closing the door carefully. "What happened?" "Lord Harrison sought me out today." Brother Marcus leaned against the wall as if needing support. He asked very specific questions about signs of demonic possession in newborns." Michael's blood ran cold. "What kind of questions?" "Whether deafness could be the result of demonic influence, whether children touched by evil exhibited unnatural behaviors, whether—" the monk hesitated, "whether it would be the Church's duty to investigate possible supernatural interventions in the birth of noble heirs." Michael closed his eyes, feeling the trap closing around Alexandra like iron ropes. Harrison wasn't just questioning the baby's ability to rule. He was planting the seeds of a witchcraft accusation. "And what did you answer?" "The truth. That deafness is a natural condition that affects many children, that there is nothing supernatural about it." Brother Marcus met Michael's eyes. "But he wasn't interested in the truth, Sir Michael. He was looking for validation for an already formed theory. Did he mention anything else?" The monk hesitated again, clearly struggling with some internal conflict. "He asked about you?" "About me. About the unusual techniques you have been using with the child. About how you managed to make the baby respond when doctors and priests failed." Brother Marcus moved closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Sir Michael, he is building a narrative that places you at the center of some kind of ritualistic practice." The realization hit Michael like a lightning bolt. Harrison was preparing 2 targets with a single arrow. If he could accuse Michael of witchcraft, he would not only get rid of a defender of Alexandra, but could also suggest that the child's deafness was the result of some malign influence. "So there's more," Brother Marcus continued, visibly distressed. "The abbot received a letter from the bishop, requesting that an ecclesiastical court be formed to investigate irregularities in the heir's birth." Michael felt the world spin around him. An ecclesiastical court meant formal inquisition, witnesses under oath, the possibility of torture to extract confessions. And once such a process began, the truth would become irrelevant. Only what the judges wanted to hear would matter. When? Within a week, maybe less. After Brother Marcus left, Michael stayed awake until dawn, planning. When the first rays of sun touched his window, he knew what he needed to do. He found Emily in the inner garden, where she usually walked in the early morning hours. She was sitting on a stone bench, watching the rose bushes still wet with dew, but Michael could tell by the tension in her shoulders that she hadn't slept either. "You already know, don't you?" he said, sitting beside her. "About the court." Emily nodded without looking at him. Harrison told me last night, said it was an opportunity to clear the air about any questionable influence in Alexandra's birth. He is cornering us. Cornering us. Emily finally turned to him, and there was something fierce in her eyes. Michael, you still don't fully understand the game he's playing. It's not just about Alexandra or you, it's about me too. What do you mean? Emily stood up, beginning to pace among the rose bushes with agitated steps. Harrison made it clear that my proximity to you and my involvement in Alexandra's care could be misinterpreted by a religious court. A single woman spending time alone with a knight, caring for a child who shows supernatural signs. She turned to him, her face pale. Do you see where this leads? Michael saw. Harrison wasn't just threatening Emily's reputation. He was creating a situation where marriage to him would become her only salvation. A woman accused of improper behavior or association with witchcraft would be socially ruined unless a powerful man offered to redeem her through matrimony. It's brilliant, Michael admitted bitterly. In a sickening way, it's absolutely brilliant and effective. Emily returned to the bench, but this time sat closer to him. Michael, there is something I need to tell you. What? Last night, after Harrison explained the situation, he offered me an alternative. Her voice was firm, but Michael could hear the effort she made to keep it that way. If I marry him immediately, before the court, he will ensure that the accusations against you are mitigated, and Alexandra will be discreetly sent to a monastery where he can receive proper care for his condition. A monastery? Michael repeated the words as if they were poison in his mouth. Where he would be safe, Emily said quickly. Where he wouldn't be judged for his difference. Where he could live a peaceful, protected life. A hidden life. A life where he will never know he is a prince. Where he will never have the chance to claim his right to the throne. Emily closed her eyes. He proposed it as a solution that protects all of us. All of us except Alexandra. And except you. Michael turned to face her completely. Emily, you cannot seriously be considering this. I am considering all available options. When she opened her eyes, there were tears in them. Because the alternative is to see you burned as a heretic, Alexandra declared, cursed, and our family ruined. At least this way, some lives are saved. And you spend the rest of your life married to a man who blackmailed you into it. Yes. The word came out as a broken whisper. That would be the price. Michael watched her for a long moment, seeing the pain she tried to hide, the way her hands trembled despite her apparent determination. Here was a woman willing to sacrifice her own happiness to protect a child and a man she loved. The nobility of her character made his heart ache, but it also made his determination solidify like steel. No, he said simply. Michael, no. He stood up, extending his hand to her. We will not accept this solution. We will not allow Harrison to force us to choose between different kinds of defeat. Emily looked at his outstretched hand, but hesitated to take it. Then what do you suggest? What miracle do you plan to perform? Not a miracle, a demonstration. What are you talking about? Michael finally smiled, and there was something fierce in the expression. I will prove, before the ecclesiastical court, that Alexandra is not cursed or touched by supernatural forces. I will demonstrate that his deafness does not prevent him from communicating, learning, or leading, and I will do it in a way so clear and undeniable that Harrison will have no choice but to retreat. How? By trusting what Alexandra has already shown me. He is intelligent, Emily, extraordinarily intelligent. And if I can teach a week-old child to respond to light and movement, I can teach him much more. Emily finally took his hand, allowing him to help her stand. And if we fail? Michael squeezed her fingers in his, feeling the warmth of her skin, the delicacy of her bones. Then at least we will have failed fighting, not surrendering. For a moment, they remained there in the morning garden, holding hands, surrounded by the beauty of the roses and the gravity of what was to come. Michael knew that the next few weeks would determine not only Alexandra's fate, but also whether he and Emily would have any chance of a future together. But for the first time since Harrison began his campaign of manipulation, Michael felt they were not completely defenseless. They had Alexandra, they had the truth, and they had each other. Perhaps it would be enough. The week leading up to the court passed in a blur of intense preparation and growing tension. Michael spent every free hour working with Alexandra, developing more complex visual signs and testing the limits of the child's communication capacity. The baby responded with increasing enthusiasm, his eyes shining with intelligence as he followed every movement, every expression, every change of light Michael created. Emily had become his silent partner in this effort. She observed every session with scholarly attention, taking mental notes on Alexandre's reactions, suggesting variations in the exercises, and gradually developing her own methods of visual communication with the child. Between them grew a dangerous and necessary intimacy, the closeness of two people united by a common purpose that transcended social conventions. Harrison, meanwhile, had intensified his campaign of whispers. Michael saw him circulating through the corridors like an elegant shadow, stopping for brief but intense conversations with influential nobles, monks, and anyone whose opinions could shape the court's outcome. Always courteous, always reasonable, always planting seeds of doubt about the nature of Alexandra's deafness and the unconventional methods Michael was using. The Duke was visibly deteriorating under the pressure. His public appearances became rare, and when Michael encountered him in the corridors, he saw a man consumed by the anguish of a father who didn't know how to protect his son from forces he barely understood. The Duchess had completely withdrawn from social life, remaining in her chambers in a state of melancholy that worried everyone. On the night before the court, Michael was alone in his simple cell when he heard soft knocking on the door. He opened it to find Emily wrapped in a dark cloak, her face partially hidden by the hood. "May I come in?" she whispered. Michael hesitated for a moment. A single woman in a man's quarters at night was exactly the kind of scandal that could destroy her, but then he saw the urgency in her eyes and stepped aside to let her pass. Emily entered and pushed the hood back, revealing disheveled hair and cheeks flushed from rushing through the dark corridors. There was something different about her, a determination Michael hadn't seen before. "I came because I need you to know something," she said without preamble. "Tomorrow, when the court begins, Harrison is going to reveal that he plans to marry me." Michael felt his stomach clench. "When?" "Immediately after the court." Regardless of the outcome, Emily began pacing the small room, her skirts rustling against the stone floor. "He calculated everything perfectly. If you are condemned, he emerges as the savior who protected an innocent woman from dangerous associations. If you are acquitted, he still ensures that I become unavailable for other possibilities." "Emily, let me finish." She stopped before him, and Michael could see the fierce determination in her green eyes. "He also told me what his strategy will be tomorrow. He will argue that you used supernatural methods to control Alexandra, that the child's responsiveness to your stimuli is proof of malign influence, not natural intelligence." Michael nodded grimly. It was exactly what he expected. "And what did you tell him?" "That I am an obedient woman who will do what is best for her family and social standing." A bitter laugh escaped her lips. "But I came here to tell you the truth." "What truth?" Emily moved closer, so close that Michael could feel the warmth of her body, the subtle scent of lavender in her hair. "That I no longer care about social standing or family obedience. That I prefer to risk everything on a chance for genuine happiness than accept a life of empty security." Michael felt his heart accelerate. "Emily, what are you saying?" "I am saying that I choose you." The words came out in an intense whisper. "I choose you, and I choose Alexandra, and I choose to fight for what is right, even if it means losing everything." Michael was paralyzed for a moment, the declaration echoing in his mind like church bells. Then, without thinking, without calculating consequences, he bent down and captured her lips with his own. The kiss was gentle at first, almost hesitant, but quickly deepened as Emily responded, her hands rising to intertwine in his hair. It was a moment stolen from time, an affirmation of love amidst the chaos surrounding them, a silent promise that, regardless of what happened in court, they would face it together. When they finally separated, Emily kept her hands on his face, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "Michael," she whispered, "promise me something. Anything. Tomorrow, when you stand before the court, don't just fight for Alexandra. Fight for us. Fight for the possibility of a world where love matters more than political convenience." "I promise," he said, kissing her forehead softly, "but I need you to promise me something too." "What?" "That no matter what Harrison tries to do tomorrow, you will not surrender. Do not marry him out of fear or pressure. Wait for me, Emily. I will find a way to make this possible." She nodded, tears finally streaming down her face. "I will wait. But Michael, if things go wrong, if the court decides against you, promise you won't attempt anything reckless. Promise you won't put yourself in further danger for my sake." It was a promise Michael wasn't sure he could keep, but seeing the anguish on her face, he nodded. "I promise I will be careful." Emily stayed a few more minutes, and they talked in whispers about strategies for the court, about signs Alexandra could demonstrate, about ways to neutralize Harrison's accusations. But both knew that ultimately everything would depend on how convincing Michael could be in proving that a week-old baby was capable of intelligent communication. When she finally left, slipping through the dark corridors like a shadow, Michael stayed awake until dawn, alternating between prayer and planning. The court would be held in the Great Hall, before an assembly of nobles, clergy, and the bishop's representatives. It would be a public spectacle, and Michael knew Harrison counted on this. The pressure of an audience would make it harder for anyone to defend questionable methods or supernatural results. When the sun rose, Michael dressed in his best attire. It wasn't much, just his cleanest tunic and a simple silver chain that had belonged to his father, and headed to Alexandra's room. He found the baby awake and alert, his blue eyes shining with usual curiosity. "Well, little prince," Michael murmured, picking the child up in his arms. "Today you need to help me prove that natural miracles are as powerful as supernatural ones." Alexandra looked at him with that intense expression that always made Michael feel he was being studied by an intelligence much older than the child's few days of life. It was almost as if the baby understood the gravity of the moment. The great hall was crowded when Michael arrived, carrying Alexandra in his arms. There was a multitude of nobles in their finest clothes, monks in dark habits, and at the center of it all, a table where the abbot, two representatives of the bishop, and, to Michael's surprise, Harrison sat as a lay advisor. The Duke was present but looked fragile and defeated, sitting in a chair near the wall as if needing support. Emily was in a gallery reserved for the court ladies, her face a mask of composure that couldn't completely hide the tension in her eyes. "Sir Michael of Greystone," the abbot called out, his voice echoing through the hall. "You are here to answer questions about unconventional methods used with the young Prince Alexandra. Are you prepared to speak the truth before God and this assembly?" Michael straightened his shoulders, holding Alexandra firmly. "I am, Your Reverence." "Then let the investigation begin." The first to speak was Harrison, and Michael had to admit the man was a masterful orator. With elegant gestures and a modulated voice that carried natural authority, he painted a picture of pious concern and patriotic duty that made several members of the audience nod in agreement. "Reverend Fathers," Harrison began, "I bring these matters not out of malice, but out of deep concern for the spiritual well-being of our community. The young prince was born with an affliction that, while it may have natural causes, has manifested in ways that defy traditional understanding." He paused, letting his words settle over the assembly like carefully planted seeds. "Sir Michael, while a knight of seemingly noble character, has employed methods that lack precedent in medical or theological literature, methods that, I must say with all respect, produce results that seem supernatural." Harrison turned to Michael, who remained standing in the center of the hall with Alexandra in his arms. "Witnesses report that he managed to make a child of a few days react to stimuli in ways that experienced physicians could not replicate. Light reflected from mirrors produces responses that border on the miraculous. Simple gestures create connections that defy our understanding of how infants develop communication." The implication was clear without being explicitly stated. If the results were miraculous, the source of the miracle needed to be identified, and if it wasn't divine, only the diabolical alternative remained. "More concerning," Harrison continued, "is the fact that Lady Emily, a young woman of exemplary reputation, has been involved in these sessions. A single woman, spending hours alone with a knight, participating in rituals unsanctioned by the church, caring for a child who exhibits signs that defy natural explanation." Michael felt anger rise in his chest, but forced himself to remain calm. Harrison was doing exactly what he had promised, turning compassionate care into suspicion of impropriety, transforming positive results into evidence of supernatural interference. The abbot leaned forward. "Sir Michael, how do you respond to these concerns?" Michael took a deep breath, looking down at Alexandra, who was awake and alert in his arms. The child's blue eyes were fixed on his face with that familiar intensity, as if expecting something. "Your Reverence," Michael began, "I ask permission to demonstrate exactly what I have been doing with Prince Alexandra, so that everyone can see with their own eyes and judge for themselves the nature of these methods." A murmur ran through the assembly. Harrison frowned slightly. He clearly hadn't expected Michael to take the initiative so directly. "Granted," the abbot said after briefly consulting his colleagues. But let it be clear that any sign of non-Christian practices will result in immediate interruption. Michael nodded and walked to an open area before the judge's table. The morning light streamed through the high windows, creating patterns of light and shadow on the stone floor. "Alexandre cannot hear," Michael said, his voice carrying clearly through the hall. "But that does not mean he cannot communicate or learn. Observe." He positioned himself so that the sunlight illuminated his face clearly, then began to move his lips deliberately, pronouncing the name Alexandre in an exaggerated manner. Immediately the baby's eyes fixed on his mouth, following every movement. "He is reading my lips," Michael explained, not understanding the words yet, but recognizing that the movements of my mouth mean something directed at him. Some members of the assembly leaned forward, interest overcoming skepticism. Michael then shifted Alexandre to one arm and used his free hand to gesture slowly in front of the child's face. When he moved his hand to the left, Alexandre followed the movement. When he moved it to the right, the baby's eyes tracked. When he made a circle in the air, Alexandre tried to follow the complete pattern. "He anticipates," Michael said. "He sees a pattern begin and tries to predict where it will end." But the real test was yet to come. Michael had spent the previous week developing a specific sequence, a game of light and shadow that required not only attention but comprehension of cause and effect. He signaled to Emily in the gallery, and she discreetly took a small mirror from her purse, an item they had planted there anticipating this moment. With subtle movements, she reflected the sunlight to create a bright spot on the wall near Michael. Alexandre's reaction was immediate and dramatic. His eyes widened, his body straightened, and he emitted a small sound of excitement, not a cry, but something that sounded almost like joyful recognition. Michael held Alexandre so he could clearly see the reflected light, then began the sequence they had practiced. Using gestures with his free hand, he directed the light movements. When he pointed left, Emily moved the mirror to create light on the left. When he pointed right, the light moved to the right. But then came the crucial part. Michael made the gesture to the left, but Emily kept the light still. Alexandre looked where the light should have appeared, then back at Michael's face with an expression that could only be described as confusion. "See?" Michael said, his voice filled with emotion. He expected the light to follow my gesture. When it didn't, he was confused. This means he understands the connection between cause and effect, between signal and response. Emily then moved the light to the correct position, and Alexandre reacted with what seemed like visible relief, his little arms flailing with pleasure. The hall was in complete silence. Even Harrison seemed momentarily lost for words. But Michael wasn't finished. For the final demonstration, he placed Alexandre on the floor on a soft blanket, positioning himself so the child could see him clearly. Then he began to make exaggerated facial expressions, wide smiles, theatrical frowns, expressions of surprise. Alexandre didn't just observe, he tried to imitate. When Michael smiled, the baby contracted his facial muscles in an attempt at a smile. When Michael frowned, Alexandre tried to do the same. "He is learning," Michael said, looking directly at the abbot. "He is communicating. He is connecting with the world around him in ways that transcend hearing. There is nothing supernatural here, Your Reverence. There is only an extraordinarily intelligent child, finding his own way to understand and interact with his environment." The Duke rose abruptly from his chair, tears streaming down his face. "My son," he said with a broken voice, "my son is well." The abbot observed Alexandre for a long moment, then turned to consult his colleagues. The conversation was whispered, but intense. Harrison tried to intervene a few times, but was silenced by gestures from the judges. Finally, the abbot stood up. "Sir Michael of Greystone," he said, his voice echoing through the silent hall. "After observing your demonstrations and considering your explanations, this court concludes that there is no evidence of supernatural or non-Christian practices in your methods. What you have done is work with the natural capacities of a child who, though different, is clearly blessed with intelligence and vitality." A collective sigh of relief swept through the assembly. Michael felt his knees nearly give way, but managed to remain standing. "Furthermore," the abbot continued, "this court views the young prince's deafness not as an affliction or a curse, but as a difference that does not diminish his capacity to lead, learn, or inspire others." Harrison stood up, clearly trying to regain lost ground. "Your Reverence, even accepting that there is no supernatural influence, the question of governing capacity still remains. A prince who cannot hear counsel or command troops can use other senses and other methods," the Duke interrupted, his voice strong for the first time in weeks. My son has already demonstrated exceptional intelligence. With the proper education, with dedicated people like Sir Michael to aid his development, he can overcome any obstacle his difference may present." The abbot nodded. "This court agrees, and we declare that any attempt to remove the young prince from his family or position due to his deafness would be contrary to divine will and the good of the duchy." Michael looked at Harrison and saw defeat and barely contained fury on his face. But he also saw something more dangerous, the determination of a man who had not yet exhausted all his resources. The first battle had been won, but Michael knew the war was far from over. The 3 months that followed the court brought changes that transformed not only Alexandra's life, but the entire dynamic of the court. The Duke, energized by the validation of his son's abilities, had become a fervent advocate for innovative educational methods. He had sent for scholars from distant lands, doctors specializing in different forms of communication, and even artists who could help Alexandra express himself through visual means. Michael found himself in an unprecedented position, no longer just a knight in service to the house, but a respected consultant in the development of the duchy's future leader. The Duke had granted him larger apartments near the ducal chambers, a small library for his studies on visual communication, and most importantly, formal authority to oversee Alexandra's education. But the biggest changes were in Alexandra himself. At 4 months old, the baby had developed a rudimentary but impressive communication system. He could indicate his needs through specific gestures, recognized several people by the characteristic movements of their lips, and demonstrated clear preferences through facial expressions and body movements. Even more remarkably, he had begun to show signs that he understood abstract concepts like yes and no through head movements he had imitated from Michael. Emily had become an integral part of this development, and the relationship between her and Michael had evolved in a way that few at court could ignore, although many pretended not to notice. They worked together daily, developing exercises for Alexandra, creating educational games adapted to his special needs, and carefully documenting every progress. It was during one of these sessions, on a golden autumn afternoon, that Harrison's final blow was revealed. Michael was sitting on the floor of Alexandra's chambers, helping the baby practice coordination between eye and hand movement, when Emily entered with an expression of urgency that made him stand up immediately. "Michael, I need to talk to you," she said, her voice strained. "It's about Harrison. What did he do now?" Emily looked around the room, checking that they were truly alone. "He hasn't tried to challenge Alexandra directly anymore. Instead, he has been working behind the scenes to undermine the Duke's influence in the council." Michael frowned. "How?" "Spreading rumors about the Duke's mental instability, suggesting that his obsession with proving Alexandra's abilities has rendered him incapable of dealing with practical matters of government." Emily moved closer, lowering her voice. "There are nobles who have begun to question whether a man who spends so much time and resources on a disabled child has the necessary judgment to lead the duchy." The strategy was brilliant in a perverse way. Harrison no longer needed to attack Alexandra directly. He only needed to question the sanity of anyone who believed in the child's potential. "And there's more," Emily continued. "My father received a proposal from Harrison, a marriage alliance not with me, but with my younger sister. He is positioning himself to influence our family through other means." Michael felt a mixture of relief and concern. "Your sister? She's only 15, 16 next season, old enough for marriage in the eyes of the law." Emily turned to the window, watching dry leaves dance in the wind in the courtyard. "Harrison is patient, Michael. If he can't have me, he will find another way to achieve his goals." It was Alexandra who broke the moment of tension. Still on the floor where Michael had left him, the baby began to make sounds of protest. Not crying, but a specific vocalization they had learned meant he wanted attention. Michael knelt beside him, and Alexandra immediately reached out his tiny arms toward Emily. It was a gesture he had recently developed, a clear way of asking to be picked up by a specific person. "Look at that," Emily murmured, picking up Alexandra and holding him so he could see both her and Michael. "He is treating us as a unit. When he wants something from one of us, he automatically includes the other." It was true. Alexandra had begun to react to Michael and Emily as if they were an inseparable partnership. When one entered the room, he looked for the other with his eyes. During exercises, he alternated his attention between the two, as if expecting them to work in coordination. "He is showing us something," Michael said slowly, "about how families truly work. Not through contracts and political alliances, but through mutual care and understanding. Emily smiled, the first genuinely happy expression Michael had seen on her face since Harrison's renewed threats. Perhaps that's what we need to do. Stop trying to beat Harrison at his own games and start creating something completely different. What do you mean? I mean, she said, looking directly into Michael's eyes, that perhaps it is time we stopped hiding our feelings and started openly building the kind of life we want. Michael felt his heart accelerate. Emily, you know I cannot offer what Harrison can. I have no lands, titles, wealth. You have something Harrison will never have, she interrupted him. You have the ability to see value where others see defect. You have the courage to stand up for what is right even when it is difficult. And you have a heart that chooses love over political convenience. Alexandra chose that moment to make one of his new sounds of pleasure. A little gurgle that they had learned meant happiness, as if he approved of the conversation he was witnessing. Besides, Emily continued, you underestimate your position. The Duke trusts you in a way he never trusted Harrison. You have the gratitude of a ducal family and the respect of an entire court for saving Alexandra. That is worth more than gold. Michael looked at her holding Alexandra, saw the golden afternoon light playing in her hair, the tenderness with which she treated the child, the strength that radiated even when facing immense pressures. He had been certain of his feelings for her since the first day, but only now was he beginning to believe that a future together was truly possible. Emily, he said, moving closer to her, there is something I need to ask you. What? Michael took a deep breath, gathering the courage for what he was about to do. Would you marry a penniless knight who dedicates his life to the care of a deaf child and the love of an extraordinary woman? Tears filled Emily's eyes. That deaf child is going to be a prince who will change this duchy, and that extraordinary woman, she paused, smiling through the tears, already chose long ago. When they kissed, with Alexandra between them watching with his intelligent blue eyes, Michael felt as if all the pieces of his life were finally falling into the right place. Outside the window, autumn painted the world in golden hues of transformation, and inside the room a new family was being born, not through contracts or convenience, but through conscious choices of love and dedication. Harrison still posed a threat, and the political challenges hadn't disappeared. But for the first time since Alexandra was born, Michael felt they were not just surviving the storms, they were creating something strong enough to withstand any adversity. 3 weeks later, in a small but significant ceremony in the keep's chapel, Michael and Emily were married before the Duke, the Duchess, and Alexandra, who at 5 months old already showed a clear preference for remaining in the arms of one of his adoptive parents during any important event. Harrison attended the ceremony, elegant as always, offering courteous congratulations and wishes for happiness that sounded perfectly sincere to anyone who didn't know him well. But Michael saw the cold calculation in his eyes, the way he observed every interaction, every gesture of affection between the new couple. The war had not ended. It had merely taken a different form. But that night, dancing with his new wife in the great hall while Alexandra slept peacefully in the arms of a trusted nurse, Michael allowed himself to believe that love was a force as powerful as any political ambition, and that sometimes it was possible for the right people to win.